The moment I stepped into the house, something felt off. It wasn't the scent of lavender air freshener, or the faint hum of the air conditioning. It was the silence, the kind that settles over a place when something is being hidden. For weeks now my husband James had been acting strange. At first it was small things. Lingering glances at his phone, hurried conversations that abruptly ended when I walked into the room, and excuses that seemed convenient. And then there was her, our neighbor Claire. Claire was the picture-perfect suburban woman, always smiling, impeccably dressed even when taking out the trash, and a little too friendly. First I didn't mind. Neighbors help each other, right? But her requests for James's help began to pile up like snowflakes in a blizzard. James, could you help me move this heavy cabinet? James, my car won't start again. Could you take a look? James, I need someone to help hang these curtains. It started as a joke between us. Claire sure knows how to keep you busy, I tease. James would laugh, brushing it off with a casual, she just doesn't have anyone else to help. But the joke stopped being funny when I noticed the frequency of his visits to her house, and the way he'd avoid my questions afterward. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking. James and I had been together for 10 years, and he'd never given me a reason to doubt him. But the seed of suspicion had been planted, and it was growing with every unanswered text and every vague excuse. That day I came home early from work. It wasn't planned. My boss had canceled a meeting, and I decided to surprise James. I imagined us sharing a quiet lunch together, maybe even rekindling some of the spark that had been missing lately. I pulled into the driveway and noticed Claire's car parked at an odd angle, half hidden behind a row of hedges. My stomach churned. No, it's nothing. Maybe she needed his help again. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The silence was deafening. James! I called out, my voice echoing through the empty house. No answer. I wandered through the rooms, my heart pounding harder with each step. The kitchen was spotless, the living room exactly as I'd left it that morning. But then I heard it. A faint giggle coming from upstairs. My blood turned cold. I crept up the stairs, each step feeling like an eternity. As I approached the bedroom, the sound of hushed voices became clearer. One was James's, the other unmistakably Claire's. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open. There they were. James, shirtless, sitting on the edge of our bed. Claire, wrapped in one of my robes, her legs crossed casually as if she owned the place. They both froze, their faces a mixture of guilt and panic. Lena! James stammered, jumping to his feet. It's not what it looks like. Save it. I spat, my voice shaking with rage. My vision blurred as tears welled up, but I forced myself to stand tall. How long has this been going on? Claire had the audacity to smirk, her lips curling as if she found the whole situation amusing. It's not what you think, she said, her tone condescending. James was just helping me with. Don't. Just don't. My voice cracked and I could feel my composure slipping. In my house? On my bed. James reached for me, his eyes pleading. Lena, please let me explain. It's not serious. It didn't mean anything. Not serious? I repeated, my voice rising. It's serious enough that you've been lying to me. Serious enough that you've thrown away everything we built together for. What? For her. Claire's smirk faltered and she stood, trying to salvage whatever shred of dignity she thought she had. I think I should go, she muttered, slipping past me without another word. The sound of the front door closing behind her was like a gunshot. I turned back to James, my chest heaving with anger and heartbreak. He stood there, looking pathetic and small, his eyes filled with tears. I was lonely, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You've been so busy lately and I... Stop, I interrupted, holding up a hand. Don't you dare blame this on me. I've been working hard for us, for our future. And this is how you repay me. James dropped his head, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his guilt. I made a mistake, he said. But I love you, Lena. Please, don't let this ruin us. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and unfamiliar. Ruin us? You've already done that, James. You've ruined everything. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I threw his clothes into a suitcase and told him to leave. He begged, cried, and promised to fix things, but I couldn't bear to look at him. The man I thought I knew, the man I loved, had betrayed me in the worst possible way. As I sat alone in the empty house that night, I realized something. I wasn't just grieving the loss of my marriage. I was grieving the loss of trust, of security, of the future I thought we had. James called me repeatedly over the following days, but I didn't answer. Instead, I began to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. I would never let someone like Claire, or someone like James, take advantage of me again. The scars of betrayal would take time to heal, but I was determined to come out stronger. After all, the truth may hurt, but it also sets you free. The days that followed were a strange blur of emotions. Some moments I was furious, pacing the house and replaying every interaction I'd had with Claire in my head, dissecting every smile, every casual conversation. Other times I was crushed, sobbing into my pillow as the weight of it all pressed down on me. The betrayal wasn't just about James cheating. It was about the way I had been made to feel like a fool in my own home. I stopped answering his calls. The first day my phone buzzed every few minutes with his name lighting up the screen. By the second day, the calls became sporadic, and by the end of the week, they stopped altogether. It was a strange relief, but it also left a hollow ache in its place. Even after everything, part of me wanted him to keep fighting for us, to prove that I still mattered to him. But deep down, I knew that no apology or promise could undo what had been done. Claire, on the other hand, seemed to vanish overnight. Her car wasn't in the driveway, and the lights in her house stayed off. I wasn't sure if she was avoiding me or if the shame of being caught had driven her away, but I didn't care enough to find out. Every time I looked at her house, I felt a fresh wave of anger and disgust. She had wormed her way into my life, pretending to be a neighborly friend while sneaking behind my back. About a week after that awful day, I decided I couldn't stay in the house anymore. Not like this. Everywhere I looked, there were memories of James. His favorite mug sitting on the counter, the sweatshirt he always left draped over the back of the couch, the dent in the cushions where he liked to sit. It was suffocating. I started packing my things, throwing clothes and toiletries into boxes and trash bags without much thought. I was midway through sorting through the dresser when I found something that stopped me cold. Tucked beneath a stack of James's old t-shirts was an envelope. It wasn't addressed to anyone, and the handwriting on the outside wasn't his. My heart sank as I opened it, pulling out a single folded piece of paper. The letter was short, but the words felt like a knife to the chest. It was from Claire. James, I can't stop thinking about the other night. You make me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. I know this is wrong, but I don't want to stop. Let me know when you're free again. I need to see you. Claire. I stared at the note, my hands trembling. My mind raced as I pieced together the timeline, realizing just how long this had been going on. The lies, the late nights, the endless excuses. It all made sense now. The anger that had been simmering inside me boiled over. I crumpled the letter in my fist, my breathing ragged. I wasn't just angry at James anymore. I was angry at myself. How had I been so blind? How had I let this happen under my nose? I prided myself on being perceptive, on knowing James better than anyone. But I hadn't seen this coming. Or maybe I had and just didn't want to believe it. That evening, I called my best friend, Sarah. She'd been checking on me every day since the incident, but I hadn't been ready to talk about it in detail. When I told her about the letter, she didn't hold back. Lena, you've got to stop protecting him, she said firmly. This wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate. He betrayed you, and you deserve better than that. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was right. I had been making excuses for James, even in my own head, telling myself that maybe it hadn't gone too far, that maybe he regretted it. But the letter was proof that this wasn't some fleeting lapse in judgment. This was a choice he made repeatedly. The next day, I decided to confront him one last time. I called him and told him to come over, my voice cold and distant. When he arrived, he looked worn down, like he hadn't slept in days. Lena, he started, but I held up a hand to stop him. I found the letter, I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. His face paled, and he opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. I want you to listen to me, I continued. I don't care what excuses you have or how sorry you say you are. This isn't about us anymore. This is about me. I deserve better than this. I deserve better than you. James looked like he'd been slapped. For a moment I almost felt sorry for him, but then I remembered the months of lies and deceit, the way he'd made me doubt myself. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. "I'll be staying with Sarah for a while," I said, grabbing the bag I'd packed earlier. "You can keep the house. I don't want it anymore." "Lena, wait, please," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." But I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity, of strength. This wasn't the ending I'd imagined for us, but it was the one I needed. As I drove away, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for what we'd lost, for the life we'd built together that was now in ruins. But relief because I knew I was finally free. Free to start over, to rebuild my life on my terms. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never let anyone make me feel small or invisible again. And as for James and Claire, they were nothing more than a painful lesson. A reminder that trust is fragile, and once it's broken, it's nearly impossible to mend. In the weeks that followed, my life became a strange balancing act between trying to move forward and constantly being pulled back by the weight of what had happened. Staying with Sarah was a temporary solution, but it gave me the space I needed to process everything. She was supportive in ways only a best friend could be. Always ready with a glass of wine and a listening ear, but never pushing me to talk more than I wanted. I spent a lot of time thinking about what my life had become. The betrayal wasn't just about James or Claire. It was about how I'd let myself become so comfortable, so trusting, that I ignored the signs until it was too late. I replayed every moment in my head, dissecting every smile Claire had given me. Every time James had come home smelling faintly of her floral perfume. The truth was, the warning signs had been there all along. I just hadn't wanted to see them. One evening, Sarah and I were sitting on her back porch, the soft glow of string lights casting a warm glow around us. "So what's next?" she asked, her tone light but serious. I shrugged, taking a sip of my wine. "I don't know. A new place, I guess. A new life. It's not like I can go back to the old one." "You could look at it as a clean slate," she offered. "A chance to figure out what you really want." I nodded, but the idea of starting over felt daunting. My identity had been so wrapped up in being James's wife, in our life together, that I wasn't sure who I was without him. But maybe Sarah was right. Maybe this was my chance to rediscover myself. The next day I started looking for apartments. It felt strange scrolling through listings and imagining myself in these unfamiliar spaces, but it was also oddly liberating. I found a small but charming place on the other side of town, far enough from the old neighborhood that I wouldn't have to worry about running into James or Claire. Moving in felt like the first step toward reclaiming my independence. The apartment was tiny compared to the house James and I had shared, but it was mine. I spent my first night there unpacking boxes and arranging furniture, the silence a stark contrast to the noise of my thoughts. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. This was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild on my own terms. But starting over wasn't as easy as I'd hoped. Everywhere I went, there were reminders of the life I'd left behind. A song on the radio, a couple laughing together at a coffee shop. Even the smell of freshly cut grass brought memories of James flooding back. I tried to push them away, but they clung to me like shadows. One afternoon, as I was sorting through a box of old photos, I found one from our wedding day. James was smiling, his arm wrapped tightly around me, and I looked so happy, so naive. I stared at it for a long time before finally tucking it away in a drawer. That woman in the photo felt like a stranger, someone I barely recognized. Work became my escape. Throwing myself into projects and staying late at the office kept my mind occupied, and for a while it worked. But there were still nights when the loneliness crept in, when the silence of my apartment became unbearable. It was during one of those nights that I decided to join a local fitness class. A way to get out of the house and maybe meet some new people. The first class was awkward. I felt out of place among the other women, who seemed so confident and put together. But as the weeks went by, I started to find my rhythm. The instructor, a vibrant woman named Mia, was warm and encouraging, and she made me feel like I belonged. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of community. It was through Mia that I met Evan. He was one of those effortlessly charming people who made everyone feel at ease. At first, we were just part of the same group, exchanging polite smiles and casual conversation. But over time, our interactions became more frequent, lingering after class to chat, grabbing coffee with the group, and eventually just the two of us. Evan was everything James wasn't. Where James had been reserved and sometimes distant, Evan was open and honest. He had a way of making me feel seen, like I wasn't just another face in the crowd. But I was cautious. The wounds from James's betrayal were still fresh, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to let someone new into my life. One evening after class, Evan walked me to my car. The air was crisp, the first hints of autumn in the breeze. "You seem different lately," he said, his voice soft. "Different how?" I asked, curious. "Lighter. Happier." I smiled, though I wasn't sure it was entirely true. "I'm trying," I admitted. "It's been a rough few months." Evan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes it takes falling apart to figure out how to put yourself back together." His words stuck with me long after I drove home. Maybe he was right. Maybe this whole mess with James and Claire had been a wake-up call. A chance to rebuild my life into something stronger, something better. Over the next few weeks, Evan and I grew closer. He never pushed, never asked for more than I was willing to give. He was patient, letting me take things at my own pace. And slowly, I began to let my guard down. One night, as we sat on the steps outside my apartment, I told him everything. About James, about Claire, about the pain and betrayal that had nearly broken me. Evan listened without interrupting, his presence steady and reassuring. When I finished, he reached out and took my hand. "You didn't deserve any of that," he said, his voice firm. "But you're stronger than you think, Lena. You've already come so far." His words brought tears to my eyes, but for the first time in a long time, they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of hope. For the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could move forward. Not just away from James and Claire, but toward a new life. A life where I was stronger, wiser, and finally in control. As I sat there with Evan watching the stars, I realized that the scars of the past might never fully fade. But they didn't have to define me. They were a part of my story, but not the end of it. This was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, I found myself navigating a strange new chapter of my life. The apartment began to feel more like home, and with every small change I made, choosing a new set of curtains, rearranging the furniture, or adding fresh flowers to the table, it became a reflection of me. Not the version of me that had been tied to James, but the person I was becoming, independent, resilient, and slowly learning how to trust myself again. Evan continued to be a steady presence in my life. We weren't rushing into anything, which was exactly what I needed. Instead, our relationship unfolded naturally, like the slow blooming of a flower. He made me laugh in a way I hadn't in years, the kind of laugh that came from deep within, unforced and genuine. I found myself looking forward to our conversations, the way he asked questions that showed he genuinely cared about my thoughts, my dreams, my fears. One evening, as we sat in a cozy corner of a small cafe, Evan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "What's the one thing you've always wanted to do but never had the chance to?" he asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. The question caught me off guard. For so long, my life had been about routine: work, home, maintaining a marriage that I thought was unshakable. Dreams had been put on hold, boxed up and tucked away. I took a sip of my tea, thinking. "Travel," I finally said. "I've always wanted to see the world, but there was never enough time or money. And James, he wasn't much of a traveler." Evan's smile widened. "Then maybe it's time to start planning, even if it's just a weekend trip somewhere new. You deserve to see what's out there." The idea planted a seed in my mind, and over the next few days, I found myself researching destinations. It felt almost indulgent, thinking about doing something just for me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I needed it. I needed to break away from the familiar, to prove to myself that I was capable of stepping outside the safe little bubble I'd built around my life. My first trip was small. A weekend getaway to a quiet beach town a few hours away. Evan offered to come with me, but I declined. This was something I needed to do on my own. Driving down the coastal highway, windows down and music blasting, I felt a freedom I hadn't experienced in years. The salty air, the sound of waves crashing against the shore. It was like a balm for my soul. During those 2 days, I allowed myself to simply exist. I walked along the beach at sunrise, feeling the cool sand beneath my feet. I ate at a tiny seafood shack, savoring the flavors without the usual rush to get back to something or someone. I even struck up a conversation with a couple of locals, their easy laughter reminding me that the world was full of kind, interesting people. When I returned home, I felt lighter, more at peace. Evan noticed it immediately. "You look happy," he said, his smile warm and genuine. "I think I am," I admitted, surprised by how true it felt. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm really living. As the months passed, I began to take more risks, not just with travel but with my life as a whole. I started saying yes to things I would have once hesitated over, trying new hobbies, attending social events, even speaking up more at work. Each small victory built on the last, and I could feel my confidence growing. But healing isn't a straight line, and there were still moments when the past crept up on me. One afternoon, while shopping for groceries, I saw James in the produce aisle. He looked different, tired, older somehow. For a moment I froze, unsure of what to do. He hadn't noticed me yet, so I could have turned and walked away. But something in me refused to hide. I approached him, my heart pounding. "James," I said, my voice steady. He turned, his eyes widening in surprise. "Lena," he said, his voice filled with something I couldn't quite place, regret maybe, or sadness. We stood there for a moment, an awkward silence stretching between us. Finally he spoke. "You look good. Happy." "Thanks," I said, giving a small nod. "I am." He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I've thought about reaching out," he admitted, "but I figured you wouldn't want to hear from me." "You're right," I said, not unkindly but firmly. "I've moved on, James. I hope you can too." His shoulders sagged slightly, and he nodded. "I'm sorry for everything," he said softly. "You didn't deserve any of it." "I know," I replied. "But it's in the past now. I've let it go." Walking away from him that day felt like closing a chapter one hadn't realized was still open. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about freeing myself from the weight of what had happened. James was part of my story, but he no longer held power over me. Evan and I continued to grow closer, but I made sure to keep space for myself. I wasn't ready to dive headfirst into another serious relationship, and he respected that. We took things one day at a time, building a foundation based on trust and mutual respect. It was a far cry from the whirlwind romance I'd once thought I wanted, but it felt solid, real. One evening, as we sat on the balcony of my apartment, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Evan turned to me. "Do you ever think about where you'll be a year from now?" he asked. I smiled, thinking about how much had changed in just a few months. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But for the first time, I'm okay with not knowing. I'm just excited to see where life takes me." And that was the truth. For so long, I had been caught up in plans and expectations, trying to control every aspect of my life. But now I was learning to embrace the uncertainty, to find joy in the journey rather than the destination. The scars of the past were still there, faint but present, a reminder of everything I'd been through. But they no longer defined me. I was stronger now, and for the first time in a long time I was hopeful. Whatever the future held, I knew I could face it, and that was enough. As time moved on, I found myself gradually settling into a rhythm that felt natural and freeing. My days were no longer weighed down by suspicion, regret, or the constant need to second-guess every interaction. The routines I built were entirely my own, and each one became a small act of reclaiming my life. Morning runs along the nearby park trail, cooking meals that were just for me, and evenings spent reading books I'd always meant to but never had time for. All of it brought a quiet joy that I hadn't realized I was missing. Evan remained a part of my life, but he wasn't the center of it. I'd made that mistake before, letting someone else's presence overshadow my own identity, and I was determined not to repeat it. Instead, we existed alongside each other, supporting one another without losing sight of who we were individually. It was a balance I hadn't known I could have, and it was refreshing. One day, during one of our casual coffee shop chats, Evan brought up something that caught me off guard. "You ever think about writing all this down?" he asked, swirling his spoon in his cup of coffee. "Writing what down?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. "Everything you've been through. Your story. I think it could help a lot of people." The idea was so foreign to me that I laughed at first, brushing it off. Who would want to read about my life? I said, shaking my head. But the thought stayed with me. Over the next few days I kept coming back to it, wondering if there was something cathartic in the idea of putting it all into words. Writing had always been something I enjoyed, but I'd never considered it as a way to process my own experiences. Maybe Evan was onto something. One rainy Saturday afternoon I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop and stared at the blank screen. For a long moment I didn't know where to start. How do you condense a story of betrayal, heartbreak, and healing into words that make sense? But then I started typing, letting the memories flow freely, unfiltered and raw. I wrote about Claire, about James, about the moment I walked into that bedroom and my world shattered. I wrote about the sleepless nights, the anger, the doubts. But I also wrote about the strength I found, the small victories that led me to where I was now. What started as a personal exercise quickly became something more. The act of writing felt like shedding layers of pain, peeling back the hurt to reveal the resilience beneath. I didn't know if I'd ever share it with anyone, but that didn't matter. This was for me. A way to make sense of everything and to remind myself how far I'd come. By the time I reached the part of my story where Evan entered my life, I realized just how much I had changed. The person who had walked into that coffee shop months ago, hesitant and guarded, was not the same person typing these words now. I was stronger, yes, but also softer in a way. More open to the idea of happiness, more willing to embrace the unknown. Eventually, I did let Evan read what I had written. He stayed up all night going through it, and when he handed the pages back to me the next morning, his eyes were filled with something I hadn't expected, pride. "This is incredible, Lena," he said. "You have to share this with the world." I wasn't sure I was ready for that. Sharing my story meant exposing a part of myself that I had worked so hard to protect. But Evan's encouragement planted a seed, and over time the idea began to take root. I started researching blogs and online platforms, places where people shared their personal journeys. One day, with my heart pounding in my chest, I hit publish on my first post. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from strangers who had been through similar experiences, people who thanked me for putting into words what they couldn't. Women who had felt trapped in their own cycles of betrayal and self-doubt wrote to tell me that my story gave them hope. For the first time I realized that what I had gone through wasn't just my pain. It was something so many others had faced, silently and alone. The blog became a passion project, a way to connect with others and to remind myself of the strength that had carried me through. It wasn't just about sharing my story anymore. It was about creating a space where others could share theirs too. Each comment, each message was a reminder that healing wasn't a solitary journey. It was something we could do together, lifting each other up along the way. As the blog grew, so did my sense of purpose. Opportunities began to arise. An invitation to speak at a local women's group. An email from a publisher asking if I'd consider turning my posts into a book. It was surreal, but it also felt right. For so long I had felt small, invisible, overshadowed by the life I thought I needed to build with someone else. But now I was stepping into a version of myself that felt authentic and whole. Through it all, Evan remained by my side, cheering me on but never overshadowing my journey. One evening, as we sat together watching the sun set over the city, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You've really found yourself again, haven't you?" he said. I smiled, thinking about everything that had led me to this moment. "I think I've found something even better," I replied. "I've found who I was always meant to be." And for the first time in a long time I believed it. The road ahead wasn't perfectly clear, and there would still be challenges to face. But I was no longer afraid of the uncertainty. I was no longer defined by my past, by the pain or the betrayal. I was defined by the strength I had found in its aftermath, by the courage to rebuild and to embrace the life that was waiting for me. This was my story, and I was finally ready to live it fully. As the seasons shifted and the crisp air of autumn gave way to the chill of winter, I found myself marveling at how much had changed in such a short span of time. My blog had taken on a life of its own, evolving from a small personal project into a thriving community of voices. Women and a surprising number of men shared their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs, weaving a tapestry of resilience and hope that reminded me daily of the power of connection. I spent hours responding to comments and messages, often losing track of time as I became engrossed in the lives of these strangers who felt like friends. Their words were raw and honest, and they trusted me with their vulnerabilities in a way that felt humbling. In turn, I found myself opening up even more, sharing details of my journey that I'd once been too afraid to put into words. Evan remained my rock throughout it all. He was patient with my late-night writing sessions, encouraging when I doubted myself, and a source of quiet reassurance when the weight of the past threatened to creep back in. But he never tried to take credit for my growth. Instead, he celebrated it, content to be a part of my story without overshadowing it. One snowy evening, as we sat by the fireplace in his apartment, he brought up something I hadn't expected. "You know, Lena, you're doing something amazing here," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But have you thought about what's next for you? Beyond the blog, I mean." I stared into the flames, the question settling over me like a blanket. What was next? For so long, I'd been focused on surviving, on finding my footing after my world had crumbled. But now that I realized I hadn't thought much about the future beyond that. The idea both excited and terrified me. "I don't know," I admitted, turning to face him. "I guess I've been so focused on the present that I haven't thought that far ahead." Evan smiled, his eyes warm. "That's okay. Sometimes it's enough just to take things one step at a time. But when you're ready, I think you're capable of more than you realize." His words stayed with me, and over the next few weeks I found myself revisiting them often. What did I want? What was I working toward? The blog had given me a sense of purpose, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more waiting for me, just out of reach. It wasn't until I received an invitation to speak at a women's empowerment conference that the answer began to take shape. The organizer, a woman named Marissa, had stumbled upon my blog and been moved by my story. "We'd love to have you share your journey," she said during our phone call. "I think it could inspire so many people." The thought of standing in front of a room full of strangers, bearing my soul, was daunting. But as I considered her offer, I realized it was an opportunity to step even further outside my comfort zone, to embrace the vulnerability that had once scared me. After a long conversation with Sarah, who immediately volunteered to fly out and support me, I decided to say yes. The weeks leading up to the conference were a whirlwind of preparation. I spent hours drafting and revising my speech, poring over every word to make sure it captured not just my experiences but the lessons I'd learned along the way. Evan and Sarah were my sounding boards, offering feedback and encouragement as I rehearsed. By the time the day arrived, I felt a mix of nerves and excitement, my heart racing as I stepped onto the stage. The room was packed, the hum of anticipation buzzing in the air. As I looked out at the sea of faces, I took a deep breath and began to speak. I started with the moment that had changed everything. The day I walked into my bedroom and found James and Claire together. The room was silent as I recounted the heartbreak, the anger, the overwhelming sense of betrayal. But as I moved on to the healing, to the ways I had rebuilt my life piece by piece, I saw something shift in the audience. There were nods of understanding, tears glistening in a few eyes, and an unspoken connection that filled the space between us. When I finished, the applause was thunderous. People approached me afterward, sharing their own stories and thanking me for giving voice to feelings they'd struggled to articulate. It was overwhelming in the best possible way, and as I left the conference that evening, I felt a sense of fulfillment I hadn't known I was searching for. That experience marked a turning point for me. Speaking publicly about my journey became a new avenue for growth, and over time, I began to embrace it with the same passion I'd poured into my writing. I traveled to different cities, standing on stages large and small, sharing my story with audiences who reminded me of myself at my lowest point, hurt, uncertain, but yearning for hope. Each time I left feeling more grounded, more certain of the path I was on. Eventually, I decided to compile my writings into a book. It was a daunting process, revisiting the rawest moments of my past, but it also felt like a final act of closure. When the manuscript was finished and sent off to the publisher, I allowed myself a moment of quiet pride. This was my story, one I had survived and transformed into something beautiful. The book's release brought another wave of connection and support, but it also brought a deeper realization. While my story had begun with pain, it was no longer defined by it. The choices I had made, the steps I had taken to rebuild, had turned it into something far greater. A testament to resilience, to the power of starting over, and to the possibility of joy even in the face of heartbreak. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen of my apartment, cooking dinner with Evan, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. For the first time in years, my life felt whole. Not because it was perfect, far from it, but because it was mine. I had faced the worst and I had come out stronger, more open to the possibilities of love, of growth, of happiness. Evan caught my eye, smiling as he handed me a bowl of chopped vegetables. "You okay?" he asked, his tone light but concerned. I nodded, unable to keep the smile from my face. "More than okay," I said. "I think I'm finally exactly where I'm meant to be." And in that moment I knew it was true. My story wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see where it would lead. Whatever came next, I was ready. Life moved forward with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The book's release opened doors I hadn't anticipated: radio interviews, guest spots on podcasts, and even an invitation to appear on a morning talk show. It was surreal to sit in a brightly lit studio, cameras trained on me, as I recounted my story to a national audience. Each time I reminded myself why I was doing it. Not for fame or attention, but to show others that they could rebuild too. If my words helped even one person take the first step toward healing, it was worth it. Through all of this, I kept my life as grounded as possible. My mornings were still spent running along the park trails, my afternoons divided between writing and speaking engagements, and my evenings often spent with Evan. He remained a constant, his quiet support never wavering, but we kept things as simple as they'd always been. There was no rush, no pressure to define what we were or where we were going. For the first time, I wasn't worried about the future. I was just content to be in the moment. One night, as we sat on my balcony wrapped in blankets against the cool evening air, Evan broke the silence. "Do you ever think about what you've built?" he asked, his voice soft. "All these people who've been touched by your story. It's incredible, Lena." I looked out at the city lights, the faint hum of traffic rising from the streets below. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But honestly, I still feel like I'm figuring it out as I go." He smiled, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Aren't we all?" His words stuck with me. For so long, I've been focused on the idea of having everything figured out. My career, my relationships, my future. But maybe Evan was right. Maybe life wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was about learning to be okay with the questions. As winter melted into spring, I began to think more about what truly made me happy. Writing and speaking had become a passion, but I realized I wanted to do something more tangible. I started volunteering at a local women's shelter, offering workshops on resilience and self-worth. The women I met there were some of the bravest people I'd ever encountered. Their stories a testament to strength in the face of unimaginable hardship. They inspired me in ways I hadn't expected, and I found myself leaving each session feeling more fulfilled than I ever had in my professional life. One woman in particular, a young mother named Kayla, left a lasting impression on me. She had fled an abusive relationship with nothing but the clothes on her back and her toddler in tow. Despite everything she'd been through, she radiated a quiet determination that reminded me of myself. After one of the workshops, she approached me, her voice tentative. "Thank you," she said, her hands twisting nervously. "Hearing your story, it makes me feel like maybe I can start over too." Her words brought tears to my eyes. "You already have," I told her. "You've taken the hardest step, you left. Now it's about building a life that's yours." Kayla smiled, a flicker of hope in her expression, and in that moment, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. This work wasn't just about healing myself anymore. It was about helping others find their strength, their voice, their freedom. Around this time, I received an offer that would change the trajectory of my life once again. A nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting survivors of domestic abuse reached out, asking if I'd be interested in joining their team. They wanted me to develop programs that combine storytelling with practical tools for rebuilding confidence and independence. The idea thrilled me, but it also scared me. Taking on a role like this meant stepping even further out of my comfort zone. And I wasn't sure if I was ready. I turned to Sarah for advice, as I always did when faced with a major decision. We met for brunch at our favorite cafe, and as I laid out the details, she listened intently, her coffee untouched. "So what's holding you back?" she asked when I finished. I sighed, tracing the rim of my mug. "I guess I'm afraid of failing. What if I can't live up to their expectations?" What if I'm not enough? Sarah reached across the table, her hand resting on mine. Lena, you've already proven you're enough. Look at everything you've accomplished. You've turned your pain into something meaningful, something that helps people. If anyone can do this, it's you. Her words gave me the push I needed. I accepted the offer, and within weeks I was immersed in the work. It was challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated, but it was also deeply rewarding. Every workshop, every conversation with a survivor reminded me why I had said yes. This wasn't just a job, it was a calling. As my life continued to evolve, so did my relationship with Evan. Slowly but surely, we began to talk about the future. Not in the abstract, uncertain way we once had, but with intention. We discussed our goals, our dreams, and how we could build a life together while still maintaining our individuality. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real, and that was enough for me. One evening, as we walked along the river, Evan stopped and turned to me, his expression serious. Lena, he said, his voice steady, I know we've always taken things one step at a time, and I wouldn't change that. But I need you to know that I see a future with you. I don't know exactly what it looks like, but I know I want you in it. For a moment I couldn't speak. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made my heart ache in the best possible way. I want that too, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. The months that followed were a blend of hard work, quiet moments of joy, and continued growth. My life wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, still days when doubt crept in. But I had learned to face those moments with courage, to remind myself of the strength I had discovered in the depths of heartbreak. One day, as I stood in the mirror, preparing for yet another speaking engagement, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. She wasn't the same Lena who had walked into her bedroom all those months ago, shattered by betrayal. She wasn't the Lena who had doubted her worth or feared the future. This Lena was confident, capable, and ready for whatever life had to offer. As I stepped out the door, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known before. My story was still unfolding, and I didn't know what the next chapter would hold. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. I was ready to embrace the unknown, to continue building a life that was mine, and to face whatever came my way with an open heart and unwavering strength. The years that followed felt like an evolution, a constant unfolding of who I was becoming. Life no longer felt like something I was surviving. It felt like something I was actively creating, shaping with my own hands. Each day brought a new sense of purpose, whether through my work at the nonprofit, my writing, or the relationships I continued to nurture. It wasn't perfect, life never is, but it was real and it was mine. The nonprofit work became my passion, driving me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every time I stood before a group of women and shared my story, I felt the power of connection ripple through the room. It wasn't about pity or even inspiration. It was about showing them that they weren't alone, that rebuilding was possible no matter how deep the scars ran. Many of them carried burdens far heavier than mine, but their resilience was a constant reminder of the strength that lay within all of us. Kayla, the young mother I'd met during one of my first workshops, became a shining example of this. Over the years, I watched her transform her life, from finding stable housing to enrolling in school, and eventually starting her own small business. She would occasionally text me updates, photos of her daughter's birthday parties or messages celebrating a new milestone. Each one reminded me why I had chosen this path. It wasn't just about telling my story anymore. It was about helping others write theirs. Evan continued to be my partner in every sense of the word. We moved in together after a few years, not because we felt pressured to, but because it simply felt right. Our life together was quiet in the best ways. Weekend hikes, shared dinners, late-night conversations about everything and nothing. He never tried to overshadow my work or pull me away from it. Instead, he supported me in ways that felt effortless, always knowing when to step back and when to step in. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a documentary, he turned to me, his expression unusually serious. Lena, have you ever thought about what this could look like on a bigger scale? I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Well, he said, setting down his mug of tea, you've done so much with the nonprofit and the blog, but what if you could reach even more people? Like starting your own foundation, something that's entirely your vision. The idea left me momentarily speechless. I had never thought about expanding in such a way, it felt too big, too overwhelming. But as we talked it through, the possibility began to take shape in my mind. What if I could create a space that combined all the things I was passionate about? Writing, workshops, mentorship, and resources for those starting over? The idea scared me, but it also excited me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Over the next few months, I started laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the Phoenix Project. The name felt fitting, a symbol of rising from the ashes, of finding strength in the aftermath of destruction. It wasn't easy. There were late nights filled with planning, grant applications, and countless meetings with advisors. There were moments of doubt when I wondered if I was taking on more than I could handle. But every time those doubts crept in, I reminded myself of why I was doing this, of the women I had met, of the lives I hoped to impact. When the Phoenix Project officially launched, it felt like a culmination of everything I had worked for. The inaugural event was held in a community center, with women from all walks of life coming together to share their stories and support one another. As I stood before them, welcoming them to this new space, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not just in what I had created, but in the community that had come together to make it possible. Evan stood in the back of the room, his eyes shining with pride. Sarah was there too, grinning from ear to ear as she mouthed, "You did it." In that moment I realized how far I had come from the woman who had once doubted her worth, who had questioned whether she could ever rebuild. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared. It never would, but it no longer defined me. It had become part of my story, a chapter in a much larger narrative. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and opportunities. The Phoenix Project grew beyond anything I could have imagined, expanding to multiple cities and reaching thousands of people. My book went on to inspire a second one, this time focused on the stories of the women I had met through my work. Their voices, their resilience, became the heart of everything I did. Evan and I eventually married, but it was a quiet, intimate ceremony, far from the grand spectacle my first wedding had been. It wasn't about impressing anyone or following traditions. It was about celebrating the partnership we had built, the love that had grown through patience and trust. As we exchanged vows in a small garden surrounded by our closest friends, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. This wasn't the fairy tale ending I had once imagined, but it was real, and it was ours. There were still moments when the past crept in, uninvited and unwelcome. Sometimes it was a fleeting memory, a reminder of the betrayal that had once shattered me. Other times it was the realization that trust would always carry a hint of caution, no matter how much healing I had done. But those moments no longer had the power to consume me. They were like shadows, present but unable to dim the light I had built for myself. One day, as I sat in my office overlooking the bustling city below, a letter arrived from Kayla. She had written to tell me about her latest accomplishment, buying her first home. The letter was filled with gratitude, but it was her final words that stayed with me. "You showed me that it's possible to start over, no matter how broken you feel. Thank you for helping me find my wings." Tears filled my eyes as I read her words, and I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. My story wasn't just about me, it was about the ripple effect of choosing to rise, to heal, to keep going. It was about the lives we touch, often without even realizing it, simply by choosing to share our truth. As I folded the letter and placed it in my desk drawer, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be. But it was full, rich, and meaningful in ways I had never imagined. My story was still unfolding, and I was ready to embrace every chapter, no matter where it led. As time moved on, I found myself reflecting more and more on the journey that had brought me here. Not as a way to dwell on the pain, but as a means of appreciating just how far I had come. The scars of betrayal were still there, faint but undeniable, serving as a reminder of the lessons learned and the strength I had found. They didn't define me anymore, but they were a part of me, a part of the tapestry that made up my life. The Phoenix Project continued to grow beyond my wildest expectations. It became more than just a resource, it became a movement. Women who had once been participants returned as mentors, eager to share their own stories and offer guidance to others just beginning their journeys. The community was vibrant and supportive, a place where people could heal, dream, and rebuild together. Each time I saw someone take a step forward, whether it was leaving a toxic situation, finding a new job, or simply regaining their sense of self, I felt a sense of purpose that words could never fully capture. One of the most rewarding parts of the work was seeing the ripple effect it created. I began to hear from people I had never met, from different parts of the world, who had come across my blog or one of my books and found inspiration in my story. A woman in New Zealand wrote to tell me how she'd finally left a controlling relationship after reading about my experiences. A man in Canada shared how my words had helped him support his sister as she navigated her own challenges. These stories filled me with a quiet, humbling gratitude. What had once felt like an isolating pain had turned into a bridge that connected me to people I never would have known otherwise. Evan remained my greatest supporter through it all. Our life together was steady and filled with the kind of love that didn't need grand gestures to prove itself. We built a home that felt like a sanctuary, a place where we could both recharge and dream together. Even as my work demanded more of my time, he never wavered in his encouragement. He reminded me to take breaks, to celebrate the victories, no matter how small, and to hold on to the joy that had taken root in our lives. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Evan reached for my hand. "Do you ever think about what you've created?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with admiration. "All the time," I said, smiling at him. "But it still feels surreal sometimes, like it's happening to someone else." He squeezed my hand gently. "It's you, Lena. You've built something incredible. And you've done it by being yourself." His words stayed with me, a quiet affirmation that I carried into everything I did. It wasn't just about the work or the recognition. It was about the authenticity of it all, the willingness to be vulnerable and let others see the messy, imperfect parts of my journey. That was where the real connection lay, in the honesty and the shared humanity. As the years went by, life unfolded in ways I couldn't have predicted. The Phoenix Project expanded internationally, with programs and workshops popping up in places I had only dreamed of visiting. I traveled to these locations, meeting women who spoke different languages and came from vastly different cultures, but shared the same determination to reclaim their lives. It was a humbling reminder that pain and resilience were universal, and so was the capacity for hope. At home, things remained beautifully simple. Evan and I eventually decided to start a family, a decision that felt both terrifying and exciting. When our daughter Lily was born, I found myself experiencing a new kind of love, one that was fierce and all-encompassing. Holding her for the first time, I made a silent promise to her, to be the kind of mother who would always show her the strength of vulnerability, the beauty of resilience, and the power of self-worth. Balancing motherhood with my work wasn't always easy, but it was worth every sleepless night and every moment of self-doubt. Lily became a part of the community in her own way, often accompanying me to events and workshops as she grew older. Watching her interact with the women in the program, offering her shy but heartfelt encouragement, filled me with a pride I could hardly put into words. She was growing up in an environment that valued compassion, strength, and authenticity, and I could already see those values taking root in her. As I approached another milestone birthday, I found myself reflecting once again on the journey that had brought me here. The woman I had been when this all began felt like a distant memory, but I carried her with me in every step I took. She was the one who had faced the worst and chosen to rise anyway, who had taken the pain and turned it into something meaningful. She wasn't someone to leave behind. She was the foundation upon which I had built everything. One day, as I was cleaning out some old boxes in the attic, I came across a photo album I hadn't seen in years. Flipping through the pages, I saw images from my first marriage, moments frozen in time that felt like they belonged to someone else. At first, I wasn't sure how to feel, but as I looked closer, I realized something surprising. I didn't feel anger or sadness. Instead, I felt gratitude, not for the betrayal but for the lessons it had taught me. Without those moments, I wouldn't have found the strength to become who I was today. I wouldn't have discovered the depth of my resilience, or the joy of creating a life that was truly my own. Closing the album, I placed it back in the box, not out of avoidance but out of respect for the past. It was a chapter of my story, but it wasn't the whole story. And as I stood there, surrounded by the tangible pieces of my journey, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Life wasn't about erasing the pain or forgetting the struggles. It was about weaving them into the fabric of who we are, letting them add depth and richness to the story we continue to write. I went back downstairs where Evan was playing a board game with Lily at the kitchen table. Their laughter filled the room, warm and infectious, and I paused in the doorway, taking it all in. This was my life now, imperfect, unpredictable, and more beautiful than I ever could have imagined. The pain of the past had shaped me, but it hadn't defined me. What defined me was this: the love I had built, the community I had fostered, and the strength I had discovered within myself. As I joined them at the table, Lily grinned up at me. "Your turn, Mommy," she said, sliding the dice toward me. I smiled, picking up the dice and rolling them across the board. Whatever the future held, I knew I was ready for it. My story wasn't finished, not by a long shot. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I was excited to keep writing one chapter at a time.